that focus in the schools and the courses I teach and the research I'm doing. Bernadette, as you know. All right, so today we'll overview Ohio's workload law, and then we will talk about some of the highlights for the process. And then we will hear from you guys in terms of some of the challenges, some of the things that you guys are doing to problem solve those challenges, and then some of the solutions, some of those strategies that you guys implemented to help you achieve that, that desired workload determination. All right, so let's give a little quick overview of the history. In 1982, when a lot of the language started here, teachers were located in special education classrooms, and it was very unit-based. So you had a unit base for, you had a unit for children with autism, you had a unit for more severe children. And so that's how special education was provided in those unit-based classrooms. Students were assigned to those classrooms by a disability category. And if you looked at the students that were on the milder end of the continuum, they were the ones that were primarily served using a pull-out model. So you got your LD tutors or your speech pathologist would do primarily pull-out. And that was the way things were done for many years. If you guys don't mind muting on your end, I'd appreciate it, please. In 2004, we were looking at the LRE mandate as a big change. And so children with disabilities then were to be educated with their non-disabled peers to the maximum.
Oh, sorry, I accidentally muted. Chuck, hold on. Let me figure this out here.
Did I get it?
I think, okay.
Can you hear me now?
I think you're good now. We can hear you. Sorry about that.
My children wish they could have that kind of control over me. Are there people in the lobby that we need to let in?
I've been letting them in as we go along here, okay. So.
Right. Which slide did you guys stop hearing me on?
Okay.
All right, I'll just pick up by the LRE mandate. So the LRE mandate, as you guys know, that we are to provide services to special ed and related services to children with disabilities with their non-disabled peers to the maximum extent appropriate. And so you're going to see that focus in IDEA 2004. And what was occurring at that time, in addition to the LRE mandate, was that students should only be placed in restrictive settings, like separate schools or separate classrooms, if their disability warranted it. So if the nature and the severity of their disability was such that they couldn't be educated in the regular education classroom. And so there were this expectation, this LRE expectation that we were to follow. And then if a child was not to be educated with their non-disabled peers, it was for some sort of reason, that being the nature and severity of their disability. Oh, I can't move my slide forward now. All right. So thinking about those service delivery changes, we've got this LRE mandate in 2004. We've got this expectation that students should be segregated unless there's a really good reason for it. But what happened is that the Ohio Administrative Code remained unchanged since 1982. So we were still functioning under this older model, this very unit-based model. In 2008, there were some changes to the operating standards that were made, but the problem was that not everybody could agree in terms of how to improve the part that relates to service delivery, more specifically the workload rule. And so we formed a group of stakeholders then who were going to try to study the problem and come up with some recommendations. The steering committee that was formed was interdisciplinary. So you had educators and parents. Of course, you had representation from special ed and related service providers. Children's advocates were there. We had representatives from the Ohio Department of Education, as well as regulatory boards and leaders of our organization. So they all got together to study the problem that we were experiencing as it relates to the way services were delivered in Ohio. They were asked to gather information from research and to gather information from stakeholders. They were asked to analyze data and then make recommendations to the Department of Education on how to address those things that emerged through their committee meetings. And one of the big things that came out of it was the first recommendation. They had asked the Ohio Department of Education to incorporate a review of service provider ratios whenever they went out and monitored. Kind of a little status update here. So that was one of the recommendations. They will monitor if it becomes part of the focus of that review. Bernadette, is there anything that you can add to this section? I know that this was an area that
no, that was something that one of the recommendations that came out of the steering committee was that they wanted our supports and monitoring team to include looking at workload and caseload data, and they do. I checked with them and they said, yes, they do. And they will, it will become part of the focus of that review if they see issues when they look at the workload caseload data.
The second one was the ability for educational agencies throughout Ohio, so school districts, educational service centers, et cetera, to apply for an opportunity to participate in a study, which was going to become the caseload ratio study. And in this study, then, agencies that applied would be able to develop a process then for determining workload, determining that process for making a workload determination. There was funding that was tied to it, so educational agencies could receive up to $35,000 to develop an alternative method to calculate workload. Then there was also a second year of funding that was available for the implementation phase of it. And 21 school districts, or local educational agencies rather, ended up applying. There was a pretty nice spread from the different typologies in Ohio, so rural, suburban, and urban. And what we were able to do is we were able to, those 21 districts were able to study the workload and caseloads then, not of just speech pathologists, but also intervention specialists. There were a lot of OTs, PTs, as well as assistants and school psychologists that were involved in the study. And so the school districts then developed it and then implemented their workload approach to see if they were able to come up with a determination that was that would meet their needs. The results of the study. So there were various different processes that were developed. Districts had a lot of latitude, and because of that latitude, they were able to develop some pretty creative things from percentages, how much time they were expected to devote to direct services. There was a percentage or a productivity expectation. Some came up with a weighted system. Some came up with rubrics, etc. And what they were able to do is, after developing those various methods to determine workload, they were able to implement those. And then the second large part of it that came out of the study, and this was something that we didn't expect at the time, was just not the development of these approaches, but also the implementation of workload reducing or workload managing strategies. And so they were able to come up with some creative ways to say, hey, we've noticed this workload issue. We have a creative fix for it. Let's implement it and see if this was going to help us get to that desired workload that we were looking for.
Excuse me just a moment, Chuck. We had a question in the chat about if dual service providers were included in the study, and I think the clarification on that is that it would be like a PE teacher serving as both PE and APE teacher. I can say that I don't believe APE teachers were not included in this study, were they?
I don't believe so.
No, so I don't think we had any dual service providers. Keep in mind, the schools that were in this study applied to be in it. They applied for the grant in order to do the service. So it was really sort of a self-selecting process from the schools. And we just had to, we felt very lucky to get the variety that we did get from the applications. And as it turned out, we accepted all of the applications that we received. We were, at least at the time that this study was in place, Kathy Shelby was our director, and she was very much, she wanted as many participants as possible. So, it was really kind of up to those schools to apply. I'm sorry, go ahead, Chuck.
No, you can jump in anytime you want. So we, the LEAs, they developed a workload process. They came up with, weights and rubrics and productivity expectations. They came up with workload reducing strategies, and then an overarching philosophy emerged. And so this philosophy that came out of the caseload ratio study, I think, is one that can easily be adopted by the other LEAs around Ohio. And the philosophy was that in looking at that determination, it was coming up with something that would allow service providers time for their workload duties. Workload duties could be anything from providing, conducting evaluations, screenings, serving children through MTSS, as well as making sure that they have time for services for students who are on IEPs, accommodations for students delivering accommodations for students who are on 504s. And so giving them time for their workload duties as well as time for FAPE, then that should be something that should be situated within the total number of hours that that service provider is contracted to do within that work week. And so that was what their philosophy was. That was what their aim was to try to find that situation that would allow that. In looking at what the districts were able to achieve, one of the things that was a theme throughout them is that they had to determine what the workload duties were for the service providers. We do a lot of stuff. Sometimes we don't think about, oh, wow, I spent a lot of time just following up with a parent about a screening, or, hey, it didn't occur to me that I spent as much time as I did doing Medicaid billing. And so what the districts did was they determined what their workload was, and then they quantified how much time it took for them to do those various workload duties. And of course, the workload duties differed based on the service provider. When you were looking at making a determination, another thing that came out was that there were this expectation that, well, here's your job, this is what you're expected to do, but we're going to provide you a reasonable number of duties that we're going to be assigned. So these are the things that we're going to assign to you, with this notion of it being a reasonable number, meaning that it would allow you to get your workload done as well as provide services or provide FAPE to the students on your caseload. Another strategy or another thing that came out of it was that anything that was considered non-essential or something that was overflow was either reassigned to somebody else, another qualified individual, or someone was given a stipend for those types of overflow duties. So, IEP participation, those meetings before or after school, if you were participating on an MTSS team, that would be considered an overflow duty, and therefore you would be given some sort of stipend for that. And then looking at those non-essential things, there were variations with that, looking at, the hearing screenings, maybe going to the nurses, or maybe some of the more clerical types of things that people do, making appointments, copying paperwork, submitting paperwork to the board. Those types of activities might be able to be reassigned to someone else. And so that was another big thing that came out of the study. They were also looking at trying to be as efficient as possible. And so they did a lot of training of staff on referrals. And so, maybe there was a situation where somebody was not providing a comprehensive evaluation. The team would recognize this and say, okay, let's train you in terms of the best way to conduct an assessment. Or maybe we're getting a lot of inappropriate referrals. And so maybe we'll train the teachers on, who would be a child that would be appropriate to refer to the team in kindergarten versus someone who would be appropriate in first grade. We also train staff members on dismissal. What is the dismissal rule? When is it time to dismiss a child from special education and maybe move them to a different level of support within the school? Some of the districts were talking about how some students never seem to get off caseload, even though they no longer seem to be eligible anymore. And then any other kind of special ed procedures. So they looked at professional development to try to alleviate some workload issues. Inappropriate kids on caseload, students that were not being appropriately referred, paperwork bottlenecks, things of that nature. They also looked at co-teaching and training service providers on co-teaching, again, very much wanting to adhere to the LRE mandate. And so they were looking at, okay, are we able to serve our students in a different way, a more efficient way through co-teaching, facilitate that generalization into the classroom. And then also training the other people in the buildings about the roles and responsibilities of different service providers. This is what the role of the SLP is versus the role of the school psychologist. And then accommodations and modifications. You know, the one that sticks out of my mind are the FM systems. You know, having it was inefficient to have maybe one service provider be the one that was responsible for the FM systems. And if that service provider wasn't in the building that day, then the child wouldn't have access to the assistive technology. And so they wanted to make sure they trained the teachers so that they knew how to change the batteries or do troubleshooting, things of that nature. And so what ended up happening then is through all this training, they were able to reduce unnecessary referrals. They were able to streamline procedures and paperwork, and then they were ultimately able to build capacity in the system. Instead of the speech pathologist doing all the social stories, we were able to train other members of the staff to do those types of things so that the creation of those social stories would be timely, and it would also be something that it wasn't just something that fell on the backs of one service provider. And then utilizing co-planning as well. So giving the service providers time to co-plan with regular education staff so that they are able to develop those lessons that would be implemented in that least restrictive environment. There were some statistics, so we learned a lot about the process and things that people were doing to develop their workload approach. Another thing that we realized was that a large number of the service providers in the study were working well beyond what was considered a reasonable workload. And for us in the study, a reasonable workload was something that was, or something that became unreasonable rather, was when service providers were working about 20% over their contract. So if you imagine someone working 20% over, that would be considered something that in the study that was deemed to be unreasonable, and about 29% of those providers fell under that category. Another area that was a surprise to us was that 72% of the LEAs provided what was termed, I guess, for lack of better words, as extra services. And so what was happening was that they would put on IEPs maybe 30 minutes a week, but in actuality provide the child with 60 minutes. They would say, well, 30 minutes is what is needed, but if available, we'll provide the child double. They also would put 30 minutes on the IEP and say, this is the minimum. The child truly needs 60, but we're not going to put 60 on the IEP in case we have to cancel it, so we're only going to put 30. So this is a big area that needed to be addressed so that LEAs understood what FAPE was. But also on the opposite end, if a student didn't need that much services for FAPE, then it would be unnecessary to provide that amount of services, and they could use that time to complete other workload duties. Some of the big recommendations also was obviously that we adhere to the workload process, and that is what Ohio Department of Education, Barb Conrad, Becky Harker, all of us have been trying to do throughout the years, is really try to get people to follow the workload rule and use a workload process then that will allow us to achieve those different outcomes, to achieve FAPE, to serve students in LREs, et cetera. You obviously can't do this by yourself. So when we're looking at workload, it is a very system-wide type of approach. And so we need to look at a team of stakeholders to help us with that, stakeholders to help us collect data as well as to calculate those data. And so in a department, maybe it's all the school psychologists, for instance. Those are the stakeholders. We all need to collect our workload data so that we can follow a workload process to make that determination. We need to quantify our workload so that we can actually calculate that. Let's look across all service providers so we can calculate it in a quantifiable way. And then in looking at the issues, some people stop with this notion of caseload, but it truly is broader than that. It is all aspects of your job, all aspects of your workloads, those workload duties. And so quantifying how many evaluations you do, how long it takes you to do those types of things. What type of service? Is it a direct service? Is it an indirect service? So really getting down to those data that are needed so that we can plug those into some sort of process, whether it's a calculator or another thing, so that we could quantify what is actually expected of you and be able to look at whether or not that determination was appropriate. And then, of course, most importantly, are looking at those those data from the IEPs. How many, in order, for you to deliver FAPE, how many minutes a week, how many minutes are needed for you to deliver those services? Looking at intervention plans, how much time does that service provider need to collaborate with the special education teacher to train the special education teacher in terms of what she can do in the classroom to deliver those interventions? How much time do you need to train people on implementing the FM system for those students that are on 504 plans? How much time do you need to train students on self-advocacy so they can advocate for themselves as is written on their 504 plan? All right, so what we want people to do then is to evaluate the number of students on their caseload, evaluate their workload duties, not just do it as a one-time thing, but do it as an ongoing basis, on an ongoing basis. Workload changes throughout the years. You might be a little bit, or throughout the school year, you might be a little bit lighter at the beginning of the year. Maybe I'm a preschool provider, for instance. But as the school year goes on, the preschool classroom gets filled, and then all of a sudden a situation happens where now your workload determination is different. It was reasonable at the beginning of the year. Now midway through, it's not. So having that ongoing assessment of workload. Again, working on implementing those workload reducing strategies, getting that team of stakeholders together and saying, okay, let's think about this. Yes, we've always done it this way, but does it have to be done this way? Is there a more efficient way of doing this? Is there a more efficient way of doing this, or is somebody better suited to implement or to complete this workload duty? And then thinking about focused professional development. So we could have appropriate referrals. So we know when to dismiss students. So we know how to collaborate with the classroom teacher to implement classroom-based interventions. Special ed, programs, a new IEP program. How do we provide that professional development so that people have the training they need so they can work as efficiently as possible? And when people are working efficiently, they're going to be better able to manage their workload. They're not going to be spinning their wheels and wasting time. So we wanted to talk about the law. You hear this a lot, what is the law in terms of workload? I tend to talk about it as those things that are written in the Ohio operating standards, but you'll hear people call it various things: administrative code, the rules, the regulations. So what Bernadette, she helped me out with this presentation, obviously, and so one of the things that she showed was how the law or the regulations have changed since the 2004 to 2014 update of the operating standards. And so, as she had mentioned in the beginning, the word workload wasn't something that was written into the operating standards. And so with the 2014 revision, the word ratios was taken out, and what is now in there is that service providers should follow a workload determination when determining, I'm trying to move they should follow a workload process to make a workload determination for the delivery of services. And in thinking about this isn't something that it's just a school district. It's not something that's just a Board of Developmental Disabilities. It is for all educational agencies, should be determining workload for each of the service providers that work for them based on various factors. And the factors are 1, 2, and 3 that we'll get to here in a second. But in looking at this, I think that the most important thing is that there is language in the operating standards that speaks to making a workload determination, speaks to following a workload process, and speaks to the idea that it is for those special ed and related service providers that are working, and that there are elements that should be considered, which is the subsection here. Oh, and Bernadette also added to it. Notice that there's not a focus on the caseload. And so when I'm thinking about the workload approach that we have in Ohio, I keep talking about it as a two-pronged approach. And the first part, I'd like to think of it as the most important part, is the workload determination. And then the second part of it is that caseload ratio. Once you've made that determination, then you need to ensure that you are not over that maximum caseload ratio. It's not the other way around. It's not, well, we'll give you up to the maximum number and then you'll fit everything else into it. It's actually the opposite. So making that workload determination and then making sure that you don't exceed that cap or that ratio. All right. So there are several components, as I talked about, but again, you see where it says following a process. So this is where the 21 districts in the caseload ratio study, they tried to come up with their own process. Each of the districts have the latitude to come up with their own way of doing things, but it is based off of this notion of the workload approach. How you get there is up to you guys, but in looking at the outcome is the same. We want to make sure that we are following the workload rule. We want to make sure that we are achieving those important outcomes, FAPE, least restrictive environment, making sure our students are making progress toward their IEP goals, making sure that we're compliant, and then making sure that our maximum caseload ratios are not exceeded. Now, in the operating standards, it says a workload process should consider all of these, but it's not limited to just this. So what the rule, when it was revised in 2014, did was it added a few clarification points. I think the transition was something that was added, travel transition. I think third-party billing was added. And so what this does is it gives you a nice starting point for those different things that should be quantified when you're determining your workload, but it's not an exhaustive list. And so if there's things that are not on this list, it doesn't mean that the district doesn't consider those things. But this does give a nice comprehensive view of the different activities that a service provider could engage in. Another big aspect, and so for me, in looking at the workload determination, it is, okay, we're going to make a workload determination to ensure you can deliver FAPE, to ensure that the students can get those services that are needed based on the severity of their disability. And so I keep my eye on that throughout my entire workload determination. It's not just about how much time I'm working, but it's looking at, is my determination calculated in such a way that I'm able to do that most important thing, to deliver FAPE. Is the determination made in such a way that not only can I deliver FAPE, but I can deliver FAPE in the child's least restrictive environment? It's not that I have to deliver FAPE. It's not just that I have to deliver FAPE in the child's least restrictive environment, but also, is the child making progress towards the goals that were determined on the IEP? There are some rules in Ohio that also have to be factored in there. So it's not just about those important student outcomes, LRE, FAPE, progress, but it's also planning time. There is something in our administrative code that talks about the allocation of planning time. And so in looking at making our workload determination, does that service provider have time, the time that's specified in the administrative code, to plan so that they're able to do things like, collect progress monitoring data, develop those lesson plans. I didn't put the slide in here at this point, and I apologize. FAPE, LRE, student progress, planning time. Another big one is, are you completing your stuff? Those other expectations, whether they be federal, state, or local, are you completing those compliantly? For instance, there's an expectation in terms of doing observations during evaluations. Am I completing those? I have to ensure that my evaluations are valid and reliable. Am I completing an evaluation that is valid and reliable so that I'm able to determine eligibility, so that I'm able to determine the child's needs for the IEP? Those are also aspects that I'm looking at when I'm thinking about whether there's a reasonable determination. So I've got data about my work week, my work day, how many hours a week am I working, how long is how many days within a work week. I'm thinking about how much planning time I have. I think about those, when is the student available? There are certain times where I could be providing services, but if the children aren't available for services, then I'm not able to fill those spots in with student services, whether they be IEP or MTSS interventions. I also look at those standard deductions. I talk about when I was working in Hawaii, there was an expectation that there was a staff meeting every week for 45 minutes. And no matter how many students were on my caseload, I was expected to attend that meeting for 45 minutes. If you have any kind of supervision requirements, let's say you have an OTA and you're, in order to ensure that they are properly supervised, in order to ensure that you are monitoring progress for the students that they're serving, I have to spend this much time with them a month. Well, is that time built into your schedule? So those are the standard deductions. Those are the things that no matter how many kids I'm seeing myself, I still have to give myself time in my work week to ensure that those things are getting done. So the student outcomes, FAPE, LRE, progress, compliance with paperwork. I have to think about my work week, how many days a week am I working, how many hours a day am I working. I have to think about when the students are available. I can't pull them out of recess. I can't pull them out of specials. I can only pull them out from this time to this time. I have to think about my standard deductions, those things that no matter how many students I have on my caseload, I have to absolutely get those things done. Maybe it's bus duty, for instance. That could be another thing. Here are some of the things that I teased out for the standard deductions. These would be things that I would subtract from my overall time. These would be things that would prevent me from seeing students. These are the things that have to get done and prevent me from getting paperwork done, for instance. If you don't mind muting your...
Yeah. Please mute everyone. Somebody please mute. Thank you.
Okay, and so in looking at all those things, I'm creating this process for me to calculate workload. Then what I'm looking at when I'm engaging in this is, okay, do I have my IEPs? Do I have my 504 plans? Do those reflect FAPE? I'm looking at all the progress that my students have. Which students are not making progress? I'm looking at LRE, which if I'm seeing 100% of my students in pullout, for instance, how did I determine that the pullout was the least restrictive environment for all these children on my caseload? Am I serving children in the classroom who are appropriately, or whose least restrictive environment would be the classroom? Am I providing services in a way that's detailed on the IEP or 504 plan? Or am I providing that extra stuff? And then in looking at, I'm collecting all these data, I'm thinking to myself, am I being compliant with federal, state, and local rules, regulations, whatever you want to call it? Compliance could be timelines. Am I getting my stuff done on time? Is my paperwork done correctly? Or am I forgetting to add things to it? Oh, I didn't have time to do the progress monitoring data. I'm just going to leave that blank. Or, hey, I didn't have time to interview the family. Therefore, I'm not going to add an interview to my evaluation. Or looking at meetings, I'm going to try to attend every single meeting I can, or on the opposite end of things, I'm not going to attend very many meetings, even though I'm the person that needs to be there to interpret stuff. Am I doing these things compliantly? Am I getting my Medicaid billing done on time? Am I supervising my assistants adequately? These are all the things that I'm thinking about as I'm looking at coming up with this proposal in terms of my workload determination. And then I've got all these data then, and what I need to do then is to calculate what am I doing? And then saying, okay, this is what I'm doing, but it's not defensible. What I'm doing is not meeting the needs of my students. Because of my workload, I'm not delivering FAPE. Because of my workload, my students aren't making progress because I'm not seeing them enough. Or because of my workload, I'm not able to make students, I can't get students to generalize skills into the classroom because I don't have time to get into the classroom. And so I'm looking at not just the hours a week that I'm working, but I'm also looking at whether or not I'm achieving those important outcomes: FAPE, LRE, student progress, compliance with local, state, and federal mandates, things like that. Now, I prefer to use a calculator. I like to put my data into a calculator so all that math can be done for me. There isn't an expectation that this is something that's required. That's just something that's useful for me. I created one on the Omni website. Barb has a beautiful one that she's developed. The American Speech and Hearing Association has their own version. If you don't need it and you're able to do it in your own format, that is something that is certainly up to you. But for me, that is the way that I'm able to use data, quantify what I'm doing, the time that's needed for those things, consider those data within the context of those important student outcomes, look at opportunities for me to implement strategies to try to help with any kind of workload problems, the opportunity to either deliver or request professional development to help me out with any kind of workload problems, and then ultimately to take this to administration as a team to try to come up with what ends up being that appropriate workload determination based on all the data you collected. All right, I think at this point I will pass this over to Bernadette.
Okay, thank you so much, Chuck, for that excellent explanation. And one thing I do want to mention, expand upon that Chuck mentioned, in the operating standards, we did not put that a caseload calculator must be used. We do have one on our website. If you go to the department's website and put in workload, caseload, or any combination of that, our website will come up with all of the workload information, and there is what's called a caseload calculator on there that is an optional tool. People get confused about that sometimes and think that that's required. What we did require in the operating standards is that a workload process must be used, and as Chuck said, this is up to each school district. As you know, we have local control in Ohio, local school board control. So this gives the school districts that independence to choose, but they must use a process to choose their own kind of process. And also, Chuck made a reference to the Ocali Omni website. And if you Google Ocali Omni or some combination of that, that will take you to the Omni website, which is actually speech language guidelines. But I think in this particular case, the workload module that Chuck has would apply to a lot of people. So, you know, a lot of different professions. So you can go there and look at his information that he has on there. It's a very good module about caseload, workload. And if you're still just feeling like, I'm not quite sure I'm understanding all this, that would be an excellent follow-up. I do get questions to the effect of, is the workload, that the workload process is optional? No, it is not. As you saw, it is in our operating standards, in our Ohio regulations. It is not optional. It must be used. And sometimes I even hear about caseload caps, which people will say, well, isn't it best practice that an OT not have more than 50 students? No, that is the cap. And basically, if you think about the caseload caps, how do they work with the workload process? Well, basically, the caseload caps say that no matter what, you cannot go over this number. Now, based on workload factors, you may have to go below that number. And to me, the most important workload factor is the severity of the needs of the students. So, and that is the beauty of the workload process, because just saying 50 students or 80 students simply does not capture, you know, our students. Within any kind of disability category, there is a wide range of needs of students, and we all know that. That's certainly nothing new. I think back to when I was working in the high school, and I had 9 students who were identified as multiple disabilities, MD, but they were very, very high functioning when it came to communication skills. In fact, they were awesome, but they needed a little help with some social skills and things like that. So I was going into that classroom and working with them, and the teacher and I would do social activities, and it was just really a lot of fun. Meanwhile, another speech therapist who serviced that school had 4 students who were all on augmentative communication devices, nonverbal, very involved. And I mean, she was just, you know, working circles around me in terms of the time that it and effort that it took. But if you just looked at it, well, I had 9 students, she had 4, it would look like, oh, I was working so much more, but that was certainly not the case at all. And that's where the workload approach is just, I think, is so beautiful, and that so many people have said when they use it, it works so well. And so if you're feeling like, sometimes that it's not fair, or that, your work is more maybe because based on some of the students you have or some of the workload duties, this is why the workload approach is so good. So I get the question all the time. So we've done our due diligence, we have our data. What do we do with it now? Well, if you look at your data and you see that, as Chuck pointed out, you're out of compliance in some areas, and maybe you're not able to provide FAPE to some of your students just because of the workload factors, and that would be a very serious type of issue. What do you do with that data? You go to your direct supervisor. As we always say, that's your first person that you go to, and you show them your data, and you go through and possibly get some advice, some guidance from them. Maybe they will have some suggestions for you of things that you could do differently. Maybe when you did your own study, your own time study, you found things that you were doing that were taking more time than they needed to, or something like that. So, you have some good data, you go to that person. If that proves not to be helpful, and I hear this all the time, I went to my supervisor, it didn't do any good, this type of thing, you might try the special education facilitator. I think the old-fashioned term was department head. That person might have some suggestions or some ideas. You can talk to your building principal. Maybe there's something that logistically that could work out in terms of where your workstation's located or something like that. Then you start going up the chain to special ed coordinators, your director, district administration, and your local school board. And it was really interesting. I sort of had a flashback remembering that at one time I went to the local school board, and this has been way back. At the time, I was working for the Westerville City Schools, and there were 5 of us, 5 speech pathologists. And just to give you an indication of how that district grew, when I left 26 years later, there were 24 of us. But at the time, there were 5 of us, but we, I guess in a crude way, had our own data in terms of how we, had our caseloads were too high, and we had students we needed to enroll, and we were feeling kind of afraid of all this and whatever. And so we put things together, and we went to our administrators, and really we're sort of getting nowhere with it, and other than just being told that, well, we just can't hire anyone else right now. There's nothing we can do. So we went to a school board meeting, and we presented our information to the school board. And it was really interesting because there was a parent there at the meeting, and she used part of her time to advocate for us. We hadn't planned that, but she just said, I just want to say the speech therapists have been so much help to my children, and if they need another person, then we should be listening to that and whatever. And so long story short, we got another speech pathologist. So, they're going through your local channels. I strongly recommend that you do that. And then, there are, other options, as we talked about. There is the monitoring, and it is possible to file a state complaint. And that's something that I would consider very carefully. Service providers have filed complaints against their school districts. And one thing that I would say about that is just if you decide to take that action, and there is information on our website, you can go to the dispute resolution section and get information about how to file a complaint. Just be very sure that you have the data to back it up. It's very important that you do that. Okay, next slide, Chuck. And I just want to remind everybody what the definition of a related service is. And we've talked about this many times before, but you can all read there. And I think the important thing is that a related service is required to assist a child with a disability to benefit from his or her special education. So let's keep that in mind. It's not there to, gee, it would be nice if this child had speech or OT or whatever. It really is something that they have to have in order to benefit from their special education. And the next slide, and you'll see what I'm getting to here. And I saw some questions in the chat about interventions. Boy, I am I hear you. I'm all over that because I think this is becoming a huge issue, and it's only going to become more huge as we get into MTSS, and many of your school districts already are. Um, I get feedback all the time that related service providers are providing direct interventions to sometimes as many as 20, 30 students. And I think, oh my goodness, um, that certainly is going to impact our workload. I mean, there's no doubt about that. So yes, I am open to looking at how can we manage this. And I did make some suggestions here. I really would not like to see related service providers doing those direct interventions. However, you know, that's something, I think that's something we'll have to have a meetup on to get into more about that. But here are some suggestions of ways that you can address that intervention piece that's becoming such an impact on our workloads now. Next slide. And oh yeah, eligibility. Okay, just a reminder, everybody, remember 3 things have to be there for a student to be identified under IDEA. Now remember, we are not diagnosing. I hear that term sometimes about someone being diagnosed as speech language impaired in the schools. No, that does not happen in the schools. We identify them as having a speech language disability under IDEA. Number one, they have to have the disability. That's the easy part, I think, sometimes to determine. The second part gets a little trickier. This disability must have an adverse impact on the student's educational performance. And that's why you need to do observation. You need to collect that classroom data. The classroom teacher needs to fill out an individual evaluator's report. You need to be very thorough in determining that adverse impact. And once again, what's our favorite word? Data. We need to have that. You can't just have the anecdotal, well, he seems to not be doing so good in class, and I think it's probably because of that speech. No, 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 none of that. Let's have some data as to how this disability has an adverse impact. And I just will mention adverse impact, educational performance is viewed broadly. It's never just grades. We do look at the social skills, the whole child. And then thirdly, that student needs specially designed instruction. So all 3 things have to be there for that student to qualify under IDEA. Next slide. And again, you know, there's our adverse impact on educational performance. And if it seems like I'm really talking about this a lot, here's why. We have found in our record reviews of evaluation team reports that very often that piece is missing in the evaluation team report. And, you know, I see Chuck kind of smiling there. He is a professor of speech language pathology, and he really emphasizes this, you know, with his students, and so get some pushback too, from what I understand, because, you know, we have this idea that, well, it's just speech, and I'll talk more about that. So next slide. And I'm gonna have to talk kind of quickly here. Next slide. Thank you. Okay. And there's our definition of speech language impairment. I put that in there. And again, in that definition, and this is under IDEA now, remember, and this is actually what's quoted here are operating standards, our state law, which is the same as the federal law, that adversely affects a child's educational performance. So it's technically not a speech language impairment under IDEA if it's not adversely affecting their educational performance. Next slide. And these are the myths of the speech only ETR. It's not really a disability. It's just a speech delay. You know, some people like that one a lot. No need for a comprehensive evaluation. Wrong. You need to do it all. Vision, hearing, screening, all of it. The SLP can handle this one alone. Okay. That is a really one I really do not like at all. And I think that happens too often. Academic information is not needed. Absolutely, you need academic information. And then again, vision screening, observations, classroom data are all needed. It says are not needed, of course, that is a myth. You need it all. Next slide. and identification has consequences. We have had some issues with over-identification in our state, and that is a serious problem. When you are identifying a student, it's not just speech only, or they only need OT or something like that. You are identifying them as a student with a disability, and that takes in consideration the whole child. And I'm just going to quickly share a story that I had a parent who was homeschooling her child contact me. She was very upset. She suspected that her daughter had speech language issues. She contacted her district of residence. They did the evaluation as they're required to do, and they did determine that this child would qualify as speech language impaired under IDEA, and they identified her as such, and they drafted proposed IEP as they're required to do, and just said, this is the IEP, this is our offer of a free appropriate public education. Should you decide to enroll your daughter in our school district, this is what we could offer. The parent did not want to enroll her child. She wanted to continue homeschooling, so she turned that down. But she was very upset, and she contacted me and said, I don't understand. Why can't I pay my taxes? Why can't my daughter receive speech therapy that she needs? And when we have the IEP that shows that she needs it. And what I explained to her, because it's not just speech therapy. The school district is providing a free, appropriate public education to a child with a disability. And if you look at that IEP, it's not just speech language. We're going to have profile information, future planning, transition information, information about statewide, district-wide testing, least restrictive environment. It's the whole child. And there's no way that a district can guarantee that they're providing a free, appropriate public education when that child is not enrolled. So something to keep in mind. And these are some of the consequences of identification. Next slide. And this was very important that came up in some of the speech language evaluations where there were areas of non-compliance. And I'm bringing this up because over-identification means caseloads that are too high. And it's something to keep in mind. Here are some of the reasons that these speech language evaluations were not compliant. Parents not involved in the planning, no intervention data. I couldn't reach, some of them didn't even have parent consent, which is really a problem. The evaluation wasn't addressing all the areas related to the suspected disability. The eligibility wasn't determined by a team. It was sometimes just the speech pathologist and parent, or the speech pathologist and a district rep. And then, of course, we've already talked about no data for adverse effect. Next slide. So what happened when you have incompliant ETRs and you're being monitored? You have to redo them. And oh my goodness, nobody has time for that, but they had to redo them. And what they found when they redid these non-compliant evaluations is that if you look at the little graph here, 45.5% of them remain speech language impaired. However, 42.60% were exited from special education. They did not qualify at all, and over 8% qualified in a different category. So over half of them were determined not to be speech language impaired. Next slide. So that's the importance of the thorough evaluation. Okay, we do have a little bit of time for discussion, not much. And I'm going to look at a question here. Let's see. Someone says, so should speech and language impairment be a secondary eligibility category instead of a related service in order to provide direct services? Okay, I'm in Ohio, we only have one disability category that the team has to determine what is the most appropriate disability category for that student. I'm not sure that having speech language as a secondary eligibility category would be helpful in terms of providing services to the student. in order to provide direct services? I guess I'm not quite understanding that question. Services are provided directly as a related service. How is the shift in caseload to workload communicated to school districts and administration? All the time. In fact, we spent a lot of time when it first came out talking directly we went to the Ohio Association of Pupil Services directors, I'm probably saying it wrong, OAPSA. In fact, they were our first big group that we went to. And it was a very lively discussion, as I recall, and Chuck was there too. And our director, Sue Zake at the time, and we definitely emphasized that that was important. So I think we probably need to revisit that. One of the things I hear a lot from the field is that there's a tremendous turnover in administration, special education administration. So probably that's something we need to revisit. And as it turns out, I will be talking to OAPSA at the end of this month at their conference about over-identification and disproportionality. And that sounds like an excellent opportunity for me to remind them of the workload process too. Could you shed some light on why SLP caseloads are higher than OT, PT caseloads? I really don't know why that caseload cap is 80 for speech pathologists and 50 for OT, PT. I honestly don't, and that goes back to 2008, so that goes back before my time in the department, because I looked that up too. I don't know. I do know that the speech pathologists have a weighted caseload. So some categories do have a 50 caseload cap. And I think it's kind of interesting. I have OTs contact me and say, when are we going to get a weighted caseload like the speech pathologists have? So sometimes I think it seems like, some other people maybe have it better. But, the workload process should account for that. Okay, boy, the questions are coming so quickly. Somebody said, Barb has said, it's important to be familiar with the operating standards as a service provider. Absolutely. I can't emphasize that enough. And I did put some resources. We always make the slides available to anyone who wants them. And I include the notes and everything. So if you want to email me, you certainly can. And Abby Weaver writes, longevity and caseload workload levels may need to be closely looked at to make sure we retain current specialists in the field. Absolutely. This may mean caps need to be lowered. Yes, and that's, again, as I said, when we get the current rule revision that's kind of still a work in progress, once that is completed, we are going to be looking very seriously at revising this, and we're going to be starting right away. We will be developing individual stakeholder groups, and by that I mean each group. Like there'll be a group for speech pathologists, a group for OT-PT, separate groups. If you've been involved in stakeholder groups in the past, you may know that sometimes it's all disciplines together. We're going to do it differently. Sarah Boney, my assistant director, is in charge of that process, and she will be on top of it. I can assure you that. One thing I do want to mention, we didn't get to, but Becky Ann Harker, a speech pathologist, contacted me with some really good suggestions of things that speech pathologists at least might consider in managing workload. She has an article in an ASHA publication, and I'm going to put the link in the chat right now. I highly recommend that, especially for speech pathologists, to check that out. So I think we are at the end of our time now, and we do try to keep these to an hour. Thank you all. This has been really delightful. I'm so glad to see all the interest in the chat, and I will try to get to those questions. Thanks to our special guest, Dr. Carlin, for an excellent explanation, and all of you, and I hope that you all have a beautiful afternoon and evening. Thank you. Hi, Joe. I'm gonna stop the recording here. Hold on. Okay.